Welcome to MacroEdge Radio. Please note that the content aired on this program is intended strictly for entertainment and educational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or professional advice. The opinions, discussions, and views expressed by our contributors, guests, and associated MacroEdge staff are their own and do not necessarily represent the official stance, strategy, or opinions of the MacroEdge organization or any of its affiliates. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, MacroEdge Radio makes no representation or warranties of any kind expressed or implied about the completeness, accuracy, reliability, suitability, or availability of the content of this show. Any reliance you place on such information is therefore strictly at your own risk. We do not endorse or assume responsibility for the accuracy or reliability of any information offered by third-party websites linked through the show or any website or feature linked in any banner or other advertising. We will not be a party to or in any way be responsible for monitoring any transaction between you and any third-party providers of products or services. All audio content of MacroEdge Radio is the intellectual property of the MacroEdge organization, and any use, reproduction, or redistribution of this content without the express written consent of the MacroEdge organization is strictly prohibited. All rights reserved. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MacroEdge Radio Cold and Flu Edition for Friday, July 12th at 3 o'clock special with our very special guests, Neely Tamminga, economist, researcher, and someone who I will let fill in her own resume because, gang, what's going to happen today will be something special. If you bear with me on occasion, I might have to hit the cough button due to some unfortunate circumstances. I obtained a bad cold while I was over in Orlando at Universal last weekend, and this is just part of life and suffering in the great state of Florida.
Okay.
With that being established, I'd like to welcome everybody to the program. We're filling the room up quickly here on X Spaces. This program, we're going to focus more on the macroeconomic side of things and ask a lot of questions pertaining to what's been going on with the data, what's been happening with our economy, and the direction it might take. And with no further reservations, if anybody does not have a problem, I will go ahead and introduce Neely. Neely, are you ready to speak?
Sure, I'm here. I'm so sorry you have a cold right now.
Yeah, I know.
It's summer.
In Florida, where you have to go into air conditioning. It's the pits. It's like getting the flu in Minnesota in January.
You have no way to escape. You have to be there.
Exactly.
I was born in Florida, you know.
Oh.
So I know about your great state. My birth state.
Well, so was I. So we have something on much of the audience that a lot of people don't understand. And believe it or not, my wife's from Minnesota, so I get that also.
That's awesome.
Well, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself, fill in about your website that you work with, and then we're going to start into, because Distill IQ is fascinating. I'd like to go ahead and get that going because from that point, we're going to start hitting some more of the macroeconomic discussion. I think there's a lot to cover, and the data is suspect at times and insane at other times. Please, go right ahead.
What an intro. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this afternoon to hang out with your crew. A lot of respect for MacroEdge and all that you guys do. You have data-driven insights, and that's fun for a data geek like myself. So really appreciate all the work that you guys do out there on the Twitter sphere. Background. What do I currently do? I hold two phenomenal jobs, and I feel very blessed to do so. First and foremost, we consult as advisors to CEOs and boards on matters of the consumer economy. So sometimes I get called an economist. I'm personally uncomfortable with that specific title because really what we're very focused on is consumer economy. Now, you have to bring your level best to do that since it's such a significant part of the economy. And we are unique in that we don't disaggregate our views on consumer behavior and spending from labor economy. Sometimes you have straight up labor economists and other, they get really siloed. We're not. We kind of cut through all the silos. But we're very focusing on the consumer economy. Now, how did I get here? I was on Wall Street for 20 years, was the head of the global research practice on the consumer sector at Piper Jaffray, which is now known as Piper Sandler, for 15 years. I served at that firm. Took more than a dozen companies public in the discretionary retail side and sector. Names you would know like Ulta Beauty, Restoration Hardware, Express, Vera Bradley, was involved adjacently to the Crocs IPO, so very familiar with the brands and the stocks that are floating around kind of the ether today, and involved in many cases part of their origin story. In that practice, what made us unique, and I think what helps our perspective when we navigate all of the different disparate data sets that exist right now, is to do a Wall Street job well with credibility with portfolio managers as well as iBanking, clients. You have to have a long-term perspective that cuts across the noise. And to do that, you have to kind of really think longer term. And our coverage was unique in that we would look at a consumer and not just a modality. So it's very common for coverage in Wall Street sell side to be broken up in things like, oh, I'm just going to be the specialty store analyst, or I'm just going to be the department store analyst, or I'm just going to be the internet analyst, which was always hilarious to me because, the internet. But the reality is we actually covered stocks across all of those distribution channels, focusing on a singular consumer, kind of the female discretionary spending consumer. That switch, that look, that view made us very unique and made our research very unique. And so we were able to do a lot of firsthand surveys related to consumer spending. And so much of what I navigate even now, has roots going back to understanding and observing consumer behavior for 20 years on a firsthand basis, not just what the economic data says, but also what firsthand proprietary data sets told us. So that's what I did. That's what qualifies me to kind of do what I do now. I also teach as a university professor and help strategy work over at the university that I serve, and that is truly the hobby and joy of my life. But yeah, wife, mom, total data nerd. That's the consistency through my whole life.
That is incredible, and we appreciate that. And since I'm a total data nerd because I'm a historian, it does offer a perspective a little bit more unique that other people don't understand. Everyone sees the headline numbers, the media push numbers, et cetera, but they very rarely take a look under the hood to see what's happening, whether it's regionally, locally, or in specific industries, like you said.
Yeah, I agree. We like to drive home the why, of purchasing. An example that we often use in our client consulting work, an example might be Domino's Pizza, right? It is not the best pizza by any stretch of the imagination. I can find better pizza all day long in any city you go. It does well because it's actually the most assured pizza. The reason why people buy Domino's is because they know exactly what it's going to taste like, exactly the size. They know exactly the price. It's $5 to $6 per mouth being fed at every single instance. And with that Domino's tracker exactly when it's going to arrive. Assurance matters in consumer spending just as much as product or place or price. So it's understanding the why behind consumer spending is just exceedingly important to the whole process.
And that'll bring into the question, because obviously we've had a lot of discussions with the MacroEdge team over commercial real estate and the impacts of what's happening, not just with retail, but restaurants, et cetera, across the spectrum. What is your generalized take on where the consumer is right now? Right now, my opinion and a few others' opinions are that they're on the edge. If you were in that middle to lower middle class or lower income strata, you're hesitant to make a large purchase or spend. There's some people running scared in parts of the country. It's not universal across the country, but there seems to be a little fear in the lower income strata of the economy. And it does seem to be reflected with the soon-to-be demised Big Lots and other retailers like Dollar Tree taking a price increase again, whose model works great when inflation is subdued, but when inflation runs wild, well, here we are getting ready to see an increase to $1.50 later on this summer. What is your take on where the consumer is feeling right now? Is it just a regionalized basis, or is it a national trepidation?
It's such a great question. It's like the number one question we're being asked in our consulting work. How's, quote, the consumer? And our response, and we're not trying to be cheeky about it, but, our response is, which consumer? Let's talk about. And, I think this is such an important point, and it lands every time we, discuss this in our engagements. We've just in the last 3 or 4 years have become so accustomed to a monolithic consumer, because when you shut down the economy as we did in the spring of 2020, everybody stops shopping, right? Because you just all of a sudden stop. And then, everyone's priorities became toilet paper. Everybody bought toilet paper. And then everyone's priorities were making sure there's enough protein and water in your house. And we did that. And you saw all the stockouts that occurred because of it. And then all of a sudden, the vaccine came, right? And then everybody wanted to get back. Then you can go back and everyone starts to shop again. And you saw that all happen in mass, and restaurant activity happen in mass. And then everyone wanted to travel and revenge travel all at the same time. So I don't blame anybody for getting confused about, quote, the consumer, because it is in fact acted like a singular consumer since March 2020. But in 2024, what we're starting to see emerge for a variety of consumer capacity reasons is differences. And this is why, sometimes I think I get panned for being, overly bearish. I'm not. I'm focusing on the unknowns, and there is concern and risk in the unknowns. Jamie Dimon talked about that today, right? You also have, our Fed chair has referred to this in some way or another. There are still unknowns that exist in the economy, and that's where a lot of our work is focused, is making sure we understand the magnitude and the size of that unknown on the consumer side. So long-winded way to go back to your question, how's the consumer? Which one? You're right. We have a middle, to lower middle sort of income consumer that we're, very concerned about. I'll get more granular about that in a minute. I'm really not concerned about the retiree yet, because the stock market is fueling a lot of that. The interest rates are fueling a lot of that stability. That's not really at risk per se on the retiree economy. And I'm a little concerned about, what maybe some of the early retirees might experience if we have an issue where they might need to go back and return to work. But it's fairly low on the totem pole, as it were, for our concerns. So the two areas we are most focused on are, hey, who are the small business owners that really benefited from stimulus, whether it was PPP1, PPP2, PPP3, ERTC, like all the different stimulus programs, who might be actually on Medicaid right now because they were able to qualify through pandemic assistance and renew. That consumer were, the people who own those businesses, very concerned about what might be a ticking time bomb in kind of over-levered SMBs that, small businesses, that the demand is normalizing or slowing and there's not going to be anything to save them. That's a concern. Okay. So that's in 32 million small businesses. From an exposure perspective, there's probably about 4 million kind of what I would consider subprime small businesses that we're watching like a hawk. And that's enough to kind of make problems, especially to your point on commercial real estate. The second group that we're very focused on would be this kind of, call it 18 or 20 to 30-year-old, over-levered, underemployed, buy now, pay later using consumer. That's about 50-ish million consumers overall, I think, off the top of my head. It's not small. They're not mighty in their consumption per se, but, their financial wealth and health could affect other demographic groups, a la their boomer parents. So it's something that we're watching really closely as well. So those are like the two primary groups. They do happen in some ways to hit that kind of middle income to lower income if you look at just income, but we're looking more at their life stage of what's going on in their lives.
Fantastic. So we all have the same concerns. The statistically majority of the population, excuse me, this is the cold speaking, the statistical majority of the population, the largest group by income, is actually being squeezed, but most people are so busy looking at the retirees and the upper middle and upper income strata, they're missing the forest for the trees, for lack of a better term. Is that the best way to summarize it?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Yeah, I think that's a good place to be. There's a lot of interesting themes kind of underneath this. You know, the third area that we're very focused on, I see my very good friend Weimar in here as well, is on kind of the health of the job market. The Dallas Fed recently did a report about kind of migrant population and what have you. So, you know, is the job market as strong as everybody thinks? That's something that we're kind of also very focused on, and that would cut across all of the other groups because it's transcendent. You know, if all of a sudden the unemployment market or if all of a sudden the employment market starts to show significant weakness as it is starting to show some weakness, that is the rate of that change, of that increase, not just the absolute levels, but the rate of how it gets there could be enough to spook quite a bit of people. So that's the third area.
I'm going to come back to the original subject. We were talking about this, and the buy now, pay later aspect is an interesting question. What do you see as the impact from the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, the CPFB, and their ruling requiring BNPL to be treated like or as a credit card? What impact will that have on that generation? And is the small retail, small restaurant, mom and pops prepared for that? Because I think it's going to have a pretty dramatic effect, especially if it starts hitting credit reports.
You're exactly right. I haven't studied it probably as closely as you have, but I will tell you at a very high level what's happened on credit scores is there was a whole re-rating of the FICO credit score, like I think it happened like right at the beginning of the pandemic. And everybody was kind of re-rated higher overall. It just kind of migrated and moved higher. And then, of course, we went into forbearance. So you have, 26 million households that decided to, take the government up on the opportunity to not repay their student loans for 44 or 45 consecutive months. And during that time frame, there was, those loans were gone off the credit report. And therefore, I would articulate that there were overinflated credit scoring going on while millions of cars and millions of homes were being purchased during those 44 months. I'm not alone in this. There's been white papers done by academics on, in fact, that is true. It's largely in that kind of, call it around that 30-ish year-old customer that overextended themselves during that time frame. So as student loans have come back online, that has caused, we think, a little bit of additional pressure. But it's still a little bit TBD. I mean, I think as late as, was it November, December, the Department of Education said, 40% of the payers that were supposed to be paying were kind of not paying at that point in time. And in fact, you can see that's largely held that same level of repayment because we can track this on a daily basis in the Treasury data. And so I'm a little concerned about what happens when we actually, first and foremost, report delinquencies on just the student loan issue, which is probably even larger than the buy now, pay later. But each of those two events, or in some cases, the Venn diagram will cross over for a certain subset of consumers, and that will then significantly affect their credit score and reporting, and they just won't even have access, to the ability to extend, or their credit card companies might pull back kind of their opening balances, which reduces their ability to expand in spending. So yeah, we're watching that closely. I thought it was really interesting that I think both Bank of America and JP Morgan recently, maybe Wells Fargo as well, talking about kind of a slowdown in card spending overall. Perhaps it's preventative, ahead of what might be happening, but it's I believe that's coming. I think that's a very real and measurable risk. So that's that 20 to 30-year-old demographic and consumer is potentially going to be very much at risk when those two events happen.
Well, don't worry about this quarter. Prime Day is next week, and my wife will hold up the economy single-handedly. Moving on, one more aspect that I'm going to bring forward, and that is the retirees. You were talking about that when we were talking about the consumer and breaking them into different groups. One of the things we're seeing now is the potential of forced selling of their homes. It's a new phenomenon in Florida, but due to the expenses, when you buy a home 20 years ago, you never anticipate homeownership, HOA fees, property taxes, insurance reaching stratospheric levels. And in some cases, retirees in their 80s and even early 90s, believe it or not, are seeing tripling and quadrupling of their rates over the last decade, putting them into the forced seller arena. Will that have an impact on the so-called retiree spending as they start to pull back at the same time that the economy slows down?
It's certainly plausible. I think about all I have to offer on this would just be some anecdotes. So, indulge the narrative, I suppose. But as I mentioned earlier, I was born in Florida. We had a second home there. My husband and I did for about 10 years, and we maybe occupied it 4 days out of the year every year because of our schedules and lives, and made a choice at a very good time and at an advantage to our family to sell it when we sold it. It was part of an HOA. Literally best decision ever. Couldn't stand very restrictive bylaws and couldn't stand the HOA president. So very happy with and very much at peace in that decision that we made. I am particularly at peace when I see the headlines coming out about like these fees and special assessments, because even when we were, in the process of selling the place, and I won't get into all the nitty gritty details, I did try to wage a proxy battle against the HOA guy, but mainly because there was mismanagement. I had uncovered through the financials that they weren't taking care of elements of the property that they said they would and should. And it just got contentious and they decided to sell and leave. But I just wonder how many other situations of this malfeasance actually exist. And people are like, oh, wait, you've got a very significant kind of charge you need to now put onto, the one-time assessments because we've failed to do something or the regulations have required us to do more than what we anticipated. I think some of that's going on. I think some of that doesn't feel that aggressive of a situation, or it's doable because there's still joy in living, 6 months in a day down in Florida for many people, and there's tax advantages why you want to do that. I have friends and family who do that, especially relative to Minnesota. You mentioned your wife was born in Minnesota. There's a very real and distinct tax advantage difference between Florida and Minnesota. So I get it and I understand it. While the stock market's doing well, it's probably doable. If the stock market starts to pull back, the first group that will pull back on their spending and that will act with full panic will be retirees. It will be retirees. It will be retirees. They are over-levered to equities. They are under-levered to reality. And they are used to spending and truly just spending. Seeing their dollars stack up because of these savings. And when that pulls back, they will react and it will be immediate. We can case study that in the past. So I am concerned about what that means, but they're very much market dominated.
Very good. I'm going to go one more question for you, and then I'm going to turn this over to Ulysses Awesome, and I see Weimar's in the house. Good to see you, sir. There was a report on MarketWatch about the exaggeration. The exact headline was, Jobs Report is exaggerating U.S. employment gains. What is going on? And, of course, highlighting some of the highlights, just hitting the high points that MacroEdge and you, I'm sure other groups have hit also, showing that we've had massive revisions. Like in January, we had a 97,000 job revision downward. And we're noticing that we're making a lot of real-time decisions at the Fed and other levels based on data that appears to be misleading or flawed, or even in some cases for political purposes, just speculating that and throwing it out, not saying it's a fact, but the evidence is there. If this continues at this pace, does that not highlight the risk of a bigger mistake policy-wise down the road?
Oh, we're on record with that. My last opportunity to speak with Charles Payne, I went on TV and talked about that issue. They were late to raise rates. They will be late to cut rates, in a meaningful way. That is our call. We're not unique or alone in that call. And talking about employment data with Mike Green in the audience just feels, wrong, because he gives the master class in explaining how and why the surveys, if no one's following them, which would be shocking, do follow Prof. Plum there. But, he does such an eloquent job of explaining why it's not just one survey that's wrong. Both of them are wrong for different reasons. And so this is what I think he calls the Fed trap. And I agree. I agree with his assessment on this issue. And there are issues on the methodology. There's issues in the counting. There's no shortage of actually issues to poke at right now with the employment data. But that is the data that they choose to follow, and that is the data that will steer them wrong. In the meanwhile, the market, I think, always can sniff this thing out better, though, than the Fed, and the market will do that, and I think continue to do that. For us, what we can control is looking maybe at some micro trends, micro groups to try to make some sense out of things. And the one that we're most focused on, like right here, right now, is looking at the new entrants. So the 20 to 24-year-old age demographic. It seems small. It seems inconsequential. It's actually a volatile data set when you look at it. But when we've widened our aperture and looked at a broader time series on that 20 to 24 age demographic, we're very concerned that in the months of May and June, you've seen significant increases on a year-over-year basis on the unemployment rate for these groups, both men and women. Why does that matter? Do we really think that 20 to 24-year-olds contribute significantly to the consumption side of the economy? No, but is that a proxy of U.S. corporations choosing to not hire new entrant talent for believing in that investment for longer-term future demand? Yes, we think that is actually a proxy. And is that actually signaling to us some concerns about what's around the corner from a profitability side? We think the answer is yes. So that's why we're watching that. It might seem very myopic with the literal thousands of data points that you could follow out of the jobs data, but right here, right now, that's where we're pretty focused.
That sounds fantastic. And by the way, that is Professor Plum. You have to follow Michael Green. He is fantastic on breaking down the employment data, and really does give you a perspective. Makes you ask questions that I believe it was Daniel DiMartino Booth who always stated the Fed is fighting the last recession, and it would appear that we might be in the same process of repeating that mistake. When you look at all of that data, it does highlight the risks that we're at, because the idea that inflation is cooled completely, I think, is a bit of a myth. I follow the Atlanta Fed sticky CPI more than anything else. It's stuck at 4.2%, and they're going to either have to reset the range or move from there. With that, I'd like to bring Ulysses Awesome onto the network. Ulysses, if you have some questions for Neely, please take over.
Thanks, John. Hi, Neely. How are you?
I'm well, sir. How are you? We're probably down the street from each other right now. Yeah, I don't know.
Probably, right? Not too far away, I'm sure. Well, I'm glad to be able to have the chance to chat with you today. You had mentioned a little bit ago retiree spending and just the older age group being the majority driver of spending. Are they also not a big contributor to student loans? I'd love to get your take on that, because some of the research that I've seen shows that they have some significant student loan debt out there as well.
You know, the Parent Plus loan model, which is probably what you're referring to, does exist, but they're not the largest group. We've done, and I'll put this up in the nest, but last summer we actually wrote like a very significant tome on student loans in the exposure by age demographic, income, all the things, psychographics around debt. It's a great piece, and it's actually still relevant today, even though, you know, it was written at a time where policy hadn't yet been extended. It's actually still relevant today. When I went back and reviewed the work, I was like, this kind of still holds. Okay. So we'll put that up on the Nest so folks can see a link to it, and it'll link you actually to our website. You don't have to. It's literally just a PDF on a URL. You don't have to download anything. It's just we're making it free in front of our consulting paywall. So it's still it's actually the 30 to 39-year-old age demographic, Ulysses, that has probably the highest exposure to the student loans, mainly because their student loans came on, the reason why they have them is largely because of graduate school debt, not undergrad, and they are in an income demographic where they simply will not be able to qualify for the SAVE plan. So when you think about exposure, and that's also the group that likely took on a lot of the new millions of homes and cars during that pandemic era while you were in forbearance. So we actually identify that 30 to 39-year-old age group as being the most exposed on repayment to student loans. Large amounts of debt, large numbers of debt, and unable to qualify for the SAVE plan. But I'll put that up in the Nest. It's a good question.
So speaking of debt, you had run a Distill report for me a while back on mortgage transactions. And I don't know if you recall that or not, but I would love to get more of your thoughts on some of the correlations that were in that. For instance, mortgage asset transactions being tied or correlating to pharmaceutical preparation manufacturing or cell phone issuance. And I'd love to get your thoughts on the correlations between mortgage asset transactions and what you found.
That was a while ago. I'd have to dig that up. I can't store everything in my brain, Ulysses. But what you're referring to, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our little data projects right now. It's a project, I think, more than a product at this point. But at Distill IQ, so if you go to iq.distilladvisory.com, you'll see we actually have a little tool, a little project that we're working on where if you're behind the paywall, you can actually just upload any data set you want, make about 2 clicks, and it will generate a 60-page report and tell you, hey, here's all the things that correlates with the economy. And it's a fun tool. I did it out of just pure curiosity, really to help us with our own clients because we get asked to respond. Usually when we get a phone call, I'm not even kidding. I would say it's probably easily 70% of the time we're engaged on a weekend. Someone finds my cell phone number on a weekend and they're like, hey, I've got a meeting this week, with the board or with this key stakeholder, and we're out of ideas to explain things. And so we really wanted to build a tool that just helped us quickly assess a few things, and this is towards that product and that idea. So I can't remember exactly what I pulled for you there, but what I can tell you is the methodology and the platform that we run that data on is pretty pristine. And so, it has opportunities for improvement, but we have about 750,000 data sets that we can pull from and run correlations literally with a couple of clicks for clients. So, yeah.
Do you mind if I posted a screenshot of just the rate page? I think people would find it interesting, and I particularly love what you built there. And it's the ability to see correlation between different, as you said, different data sets. Seeing the report firsthand was phenomenal, and it confirmed a lot of things for me, but it also created questions, and just a phenomenal report. So I'm going to post that real quick for everybody to take a peek at.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's been a love project. I also put up in the Nest our piece from, oh my gosh, almost nearly a year ago. That's hilarious. Called Compliance Defiance, Lever Pays and Never Pays, and it's really a deep dive on student loan repayment.
Awesome. Fantastic. And what I'd like to do now is bring on one of my favorite Fin Twitters, Mr. Weimar. How are you doing this afternoon, sir?
Good. I'm on the tail end of a 7-day ban, so I should be back on Twitter and tomorrow. But they let
We've
me.
missed you.
Yeah, they let me on Spaces. They let me on. I couldn't believe it. I was like, "You idiot!" So
sorry.
Yeah, I was banned by AI in half a second because I replied to a post about Newsom and Biden, and I said Newsom was waiting for him to croak, and they thought I was wishing ill will on the president or something. I wasn't, but yeah, that's why I was banned. So I actually wanted to say something though to what Neely was saying. She was making very factual points about the statutory incidence of student loans, but the economic incidence of student loans is often still borne by boomer parents, and they've been a huge beneficiary of forgiveness. I know numerous young people, millennials my age, I should say, who've had their parents take on their debt, and their parents don't pay it off right away. Their parents just assume it, not legally. They just start making the payments. And frequently the debt will have, lower interest rates to subsidize loans, like the 3 to 5%. And they're older people. They know you'll carry that debt. It's the best thing to do, especially when you can outperform in the stock market. So they basically have been min paying a lot of this time on their kids' debt. Well, now forgiveness is happening. So they're actually benefiting from that forgiveness more than it looks like on paper. So the economic incidence is often still being granted to the, quote, boomer parents. And I know people personally who this has happened to, quite a few, in fact. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing I wanted to say is check out what's been going on with the loan modification terms and basically the extension of certain stuff that was created during COVID around mortgages. The agencies under the pressure, it's Fannie and Freddie, under pressure from the FHFA, have been kind of unveiling new longer-term programs, like one of them is called like the Freddie Mac Flex modification. I think it's being implemented as early as November of this year, which could reduce your monthly P&I by up to 20%, and that's just to keep people in their homes. I know some people at my bank went to kind of a seminar with Fannie and Freddie there, and they were estimating some of these things could reduce delinquencies by up to 40%. I don't know if they mean over the life of the programs or just in the short term, because obviously these modifications, they got to be borne by somebody. That's not really clear, and it's not really clear if you're an MBS investor what's happening to your bond basically because of this. But everyone should go look this up, like Bulletin 2024-E. It's going to change how many people go into foreclosure in the long run. So the number of things like this that have been quietly happening behind the scenes, it's rife. Like there have been many, many things like this, and people need to pay attention to that. But that was kind of my points.
Weimar, let me ask you a question. Where do you think in that spectrum of, what do we know, what do we believe, what do we not yet know? I mean, what's occupying your curiosity? Clearly you've been given the gift of time with a 7-day ban, right? So what's been occupying your curiosity that you've been able to kind of double down and do your work on, thinking around the corner?
Right now, it's actually been fortuitous that I've been banned because I'm preparing a board deck at my bank. I shouldn't be messing around on Twitter, so it's good. But the things I've actually been the most focused on is how much migration has there been and where has it been going. And it's looking more and more like a lot of it, as I suspected, has been heading to my state. In fact, it appears we've gotten twice as many as the next state. And I want to do a bunch of posts on this, but I haven't been able to. But I have screenshots. And then in addition to that, I've been reading a lot of old newspapers in the last 5 days. So a lot of reading on the 1970s and past cycles when people thought that inflation had been beaten, and kind of how people talked about that at the time, including, as it turns out, Paul Volcker, who was in the early 70s, he was basically the deputy treasury secretary, and he actually, I think in 74, 75, declared that it looked like they had beaten inflation. I believe it was 71. So it's very interesting, and that was after the Nixon price controls too. So yeah, that's kind of where I've been researching this week in my downtime.
Love it. Did you catch the Mike had passed along to me the Dallas Fed piece from the 9th on immigration?
I have not read it yet, but I read the whole CBO report on it, and it's impact.
And
I actually did a big presentation at work on that to a bunch of people. It's very interesting, and it confirmed a lot of the things I was saying without data. I think that is a huge reason for why the economy has stayed as strong as it has been on paper. And I actually think a lot of the analyses that are talking about the impact are probably understating how big it's been. I've sent you some other stuff too about how some of these groups can actually qualify for Social Security, which has a lot of impacts on, the Social Security quote trust fund. It is a pay-as-you-go system, was never meant to have that, but it's going to run down faster from all this stuff. But the effect of that, just in terms of on the economy, if you're taking money out of Social Security and handing it to new entrants into the economy, is tacit stimulus. I think quietly behind the scenes, there has been a huge movement by the agencies, the regulatory agencies, to create every act of stimulus they could without Congress. And I've seen that personally where I work and how I live, but it's not being talked about very much in the press. Or if it is, people will say things like, well, there's not any evidence to that effect, which is often code for this is happening, don't talk about it.
I totally agree with you. I think the eye-opener for me, and I put it up in the nest because we've been publishing about it, has just been watching that Medicaid, the grants paid to the states on Medicaid. I mean, Medicaid should absolutely empirically be going down because allegedly we rolled off the pandemic assistance. And I show that. Like, you can see it, and when you annualize the numbers, in all of the annual tranches. And it is not going down. And the only thing I can think of is that it's going, it's somehow either being re-upped through like wink, wink, nod, nod, fill out this form this way and you'll extend your benefits. But we put 17, somewhere between 10 to 17 million people effectively got free health care because of pandemic assistance. We sunsetted that. We gave like an off-ramp on that, and no one's off-ramping it. So it's very curious to me what's going on.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, this migration thing is so much bigger than people think. I started to realize it because I was helping someone find a home, and I was going to open houses. So many people there were speaking Russian. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? And a lot of the people who fled Ukraine are actually here, and they're buying homes. And then my girlfriend gets her hair done by a Ukrainian immigrant who immigrated here 10 years ago, and she's just livid by how many people she knows have come here, how much money they're getting, how they're often working without licenses and all this other stuff because no one enforces these kind of local ordinance laws, and I'm actually opposed to them. But this person is just like, when I had to come here, I paid so much money, no one gave me shit. And these people can basically work off the books and they get side income, and then they get assistance when they want to buy a house and all this other stuff. And they have like what is it called? Like an NGO that works with them as a refugee to make sure they get in all these programs and stuff. So it's much bigger than people think, and it's having a big impact on consumption, and it's helping to keep inflation down. I think it was the head of the IMF, and she said, she said the quiet part out loud that the U.S.'s migration policy had helped to keep a lid on wages. She said that last month. So it's something you can go Google if you want to, but that's another dynamic here, and that's been very helpful to controlling some of the inflation and making sure we don't have that wage catch up to prices, which obviously helps companies.
Do we have a number on how much this might have been lifting GDP? Do you have an operating number?
So CBO estimated it's like 0.2% going forward in perpetuity. I think that it's probably very low. It seems like they don't have the full information on how much has been coming here. And I want to point something out too, and I'm going to do a bigger analysis on this. In Illinois, if you look at the homes listed for sale and how they've changed since like pre-COVID, I think they're at like 39% of the prior levels. Everything that gets listed gets bid on here. And I was like, this is weird. Other states and nationally it's down, but it's not nearly as much. So I went and looked. This is when I was like, are all the migrants really coming here? And Bloomberg did an article in February, and lo and behold, right up top was Illinois. It appeared they used some proxy. It was like applications for migrant aid in a state. Illinois was twice the next state, which was Colorado. And, you see me like on this issue. Well, why am I on this issue? Because I walk to work every day in Chicago and I see all these people, and I experience this at open houses. So I'm like, am I just in this concentrated area? And it appears that might indeed be what's been the case. Like, we do have a huge Eastern European expat population here in the Chicago suburbs. I used to live in a building full of Ukrainians and Russians. And a lot of the people who, when they fled Ukraine, ended up here, actually, in Chicago. Like, it's like if you go to places like Skokie, Prospect Heights, you will see those little Ukraine emblems, and you always did on the back of cars all over. So I think that's been a huge dynamic here. And I think the official numbers are, as of last year, like, or maybe it was early this year, it's like 180 to 200,000 Ukrainians officially under that policy for, migrants or asylum seekers have been admitted into the United States. I suspect that's probably very low, though.
Well, Weimar, I'm going to throw this back out to you real quick. And for Neely, one of the things I'm suspect on this is that if these individuals are coming into this country as quote-unquote migrants or refugees, where are they getting the credit and credit rating to justify the purchase of a home? It would seem to me like the government has become its own credit agency, rating migrants and giving them special privileges that even the poorest in our own society cannot obtain.
Well, keep in mind with a lot of these Ukrainian migrants, they're often the higher income people from Ukraine. So who's the person who can navigate this process and figure all this stuff out? It's not the person who's probably now been drafted onto the front lines of Ukraine, who's like a blue-collar guy who might not have been the most connected and smartest. It's the person who was a coder in Ukraine. They were in their mid-30s. They had a family, and they were smart enough to know, I need to get the fuck out of here. And they did very early on in the war, and they're able to use all these programs, and they probably came with a lot of resources to boot when they came over. So it may be the case that they're able to put large amounts of money down, but there's also programs to help recent immigrants buy homes. So don't rule any of that stuff out, but I'm still doing a lot of research on this because it's fascinating to me what's going on with this whole situation.
I was curious about that because in Florida we have a ban of state financial assistance to any NGO that provides those services to quote-unquote illegal migrants. There, I use the politically correct term, Elon. Don't ban me.
And Florida's one of the lowest recipient states, it looks like. So they are going where the policy favors them. One of my favorite examples of this, and I think these were not Ukrainians by any stretch because they had the person speaking Spanish, but in Denver, the city of Denver had hired an organization to speak Spanish to new immigrants to encourage them to go to New York and Chicago, where they would in fact get the best benefits. So they were educating the migrants on how much more they would get in Chicago and New York.
So at what point do you see Illinois? Let's assume the current thinking, which I think is vacuous at best, that Trump's going to be the nominee and a Republican sweep occurs. I think that's spiking the football before the Super Bowl is over. What is going to be the consequences if those states start to default and they're not bailed out by the federal government?
Well, why would they default? This is actually more than any. I mean, a lot of it's federal money at the end of the day that they're spending. And then a lot of these people will actually end up here and be workers and pay property taxes, which are immense by hook or by crook. Somebody's paying those property taxes. And Illinois, if you've paid attention, has had a slow bleed of people out of the state for many, many years because it is a trash policy state in terms of state taxes. And most of the people, I know people make light of the fact that like people are uprooting and moving. That's not actually what happens. It does on the borders of the state, though. So Indiana and near Missouri and these other states, Iowa, people just leave. So if you've been to the southwest suburbs, they call them not the southwest suburbs, the south suburbs of Illinois, they've been absolutely hollowed out by Indiana because you can go right over the border and your property taxes fall by like 70%. So they go from like 10,000 to 3,000. and it's immense. So everyone and their mother has tried to move to Indiana if they can, right over the border. But there is other stuff too, like a lot of people who are younger just decamp for other states. Like I have very few friends I went to school with in either college or high school that still live here. I'm a rare exception. And most of them have gone to places like Texas, Florida, Idaho, you name the state, because that's where the jobs are, and that's where they can get a good home or could get a home that was cheap. But yeah, look at the real estate prices. Where are they starting to break down? They're starting to break down in places like Florida. Florida's a lot less welcoming policy-wise to these people, so they're not getting quite the foot traffic from the migration wave.
That's true, and that is a fact that we're experiencing right now, not so much because of the migration, in my opinion, but because of the affordability. We've priced the middle and lower middle class out of the housing market. That's why I'm fearful of a government-sponsored solution to sit there and try and bail it out, just like they tried in 04, 05. And you were quite correct about Volcker, by the way, sir. Volcker was the one who took us off the gold standard, for those of you who want to know the official record on that. If you read his papers from 1970, you would understand that. So, Neely, you've heard all this. You've heard all this impact of the migration wave. You've heard the cycle which is occurring with people being very scared and tentative. From a retail restaurateur, the small business perspective, you might see improvements in some areas, but on the flip side of that, does that not put a little bit of trepidation and fear as we start seeing some of the older retailers? I mean, last week I was on vacation. I see this merger. My eyes bulged out. Saks and Neiman Marcus. In the old days, those guys would have been at each other's throats, like that movie Miracle on 34th Street. What do you make of the current state of retail? Does it not have to modify more to the Walmart, Amazon model, or does it face extinction?
So I'm careful about how I speak about
I understand
retail in public domain. It's ironic, right? Because it's actually where the vast majority of my expertise is, and you will rarely ever see me post about retailers, and there's a reason for that, because they are either my current or future client, right? And it's important to be careful with one's words. But I would just say my sense of the situation is the industry is still very much infrastructured on their decision making on last click, last experience, last season. It still has not yet evolved to thinking more dynamically in their forecasting. And so you think the Fed is reactionary? Retail is also very reactionary. And currently, well, I think what we're observing kind of out in the space out there is that they're in a holding pattern. They're being cautious about some of their inventory, because a lot of them got caught up on the wrong side of that in recent history, on the other side of kind of coming off the pandemic supply chain, just get it in stores, so that we're not going to be caught flat-footed. Then there was an overage, and now they're kind of holding a little bit more at bay. But they're also not pulling back quite what I think they probably should in terms of anticipating holiday. And let me just give you another, and I'll put this again up in the nest, but we produced at the beginning of the year just a cutesy little, easy to follow. Here are the key indicators of all the noise that exists in the economy. Here's what the still largely focuses on every single month. And in that, we really show that we're going to have a weird holiday season, because Thanksgiving is actually very, very late. It will the Cyber 5 will show up in December's numbers. And that is, the later that you receive that information, the more panic that can ensue, basically, in retail land. And in addition, that happens with election, November as well. So November is going to be like a really weird month. Our sense is that people, normally you get kind of the, the Columbus Day sort of pre-Black Friday sort of pricing activity. That's usually when you see the October, Prime Days, et cetera. the Circle Week, at Target, right? That all typically exists in that mid-October timeframe. Our sense of the situation broadly in the industry is that a lot of that promotional activity you're going to see hit in that August-September timeframe. So I think they're going to call it, on their holiday year earlier than normal. I think you'll see higher promotional activity earlier. It's pulled forward because of the election uncertainty. They want to capture today what they can versus what might be later. And so, I would just expect higher promotional discounts basically in Q3 and them holding their breath through the holiday season to see what happens in the economy. There's a lot of studies that can be done about retail sales in politics and presidential elections. We've done a lot of them ourselves. But I will say I remember distinctly when Bush took term 2, half the nation was so insanely unhappy, which is funny because you recast the history now and almost every single Democrat at that point who was just rattled angry, just so angry at that situation, would beg to have him back, right, as a president at this point. But half the nation was just so angry that it wasn't very robust, in the ensuing holiday season, in the retail sales season. It's because, and this goes back to where we started on looking at consumer behavior, it doesn't matter what your consumer capacity to spend is. If you are angry or if you are afraid, you don't spend. You will spend if you're sad or happy. You don't actually spend if you're angry or afraid. So the things we're looking for ahead for the consumer behavior, even for those who can spend, are they going to be angry or are they afraid?
What if they buy guns?
We're not talking about your guns and butter and steak purchasing behavior, Weimar.
Oh, but Neely, you're overlooking one thing, and it's going to be the stimulus from when Chicago gets burned down at the DNC, because when Biden steps out, it's going to be the pro-Israel versus anti-Israel candidates, and we're going to have 68 all over again. But Richard Daley Sr. is not going to be there to give shoot-to-kill orders for all the protesters.
Stop it.
So,
you can extend your ban another 7 days.
Swear to God, watch. This is typical Chicago. We got the worst fucking political convention in the worst year. It's going to be like NASCAR on steroids because we had that whole debacle with the NASCAR race last year during the thunderstorms.
I'll tell you what, if you're looking for safe passage, just come across the Milwaukee hydrofoil or whatever it is, and I'll take you under my wing. Okay.
I'm fine. My work's letting me not go in that week, so I don't have to shoot my way into work. So, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome, Weimar. And Neely, thank you, because my job is to test my guests' ability to interact with their compliance officers when they go back to work. Just part of my job as an interviewer, so I had to throw that out there. All right, folks, is there anybody else? Michael Green's in the audience, I see. Would you like to sit there and submit a question, sir? If not, we're going to sit there and move back to Mr. Awesome real quick, because I think he had one more thing to ask about, and I'm going to sit there and I've stirred the pot enough. I've tested the compliance officer. I've done my part. One question I have for you, Neely, that I think is not being taken into account. The CPFB is basically turned into this vague, nebulous rulemaking authority, which does not hold itself accountable to the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, at this time. But that might change with the Supreme Court ruling with Chevron. Does anyone in their right mind think that the CPFB is going to come out with a rash of rules between now and the election in anticipation of a possible regime change? And that might impact retail.
I wish I had more knowledge on that, but I simply don't. But I'm grateful that you alerted me to that, and I'll put it on my zone of consideration. Yeah, so it's good.
It's the geek in me. What can I say? It's just good.
I love it. I love it when the geeks out-geek the geeks. It's good. It's good.
Weimar, go ahead, sir.
Neely, question for you. What do you think of Helen of Troy's earnings?
You can't ask me specific stuff.
There we go. Now we've got someone testing the water. Way to go, Weimar. Nicely done.
Is that not a lot? I didn't know.
I'll tell you what. What's interesting about Helen of Troy is, they're not just beauty, right? It's a broad group of categories. And so I think there's actually a lot to be learned, by looking at some of these broader holding companies and looking at a variety of different categories. Candidly, I'm not surprised because I feel like Ulta, I'll talk about a specific name there, a name we took public, a name I know very, very well. They threw out some pretty negative signals early into the season. It's actually one of the reasons why we started to really perk up our ears and thinking maybe there's something to this buy now, pay later cash constraint, right? Because their customer really doesn't need their products, right? There's a tremendous amount of pantry loading, as it were, that exists in beauty. And, it was just kind of being dismissed as like, well, everyone has filters now. I'm like, well, it just seems like all of a sudden this 1 month, it started to pull back. Like that's more of a gradual sort of decline on that sort of shift in behavior, not like a 1 month sort of halt in spending. I think there's something about the spending hangover that occurred with the buy now, pay later and just kind of catching up their consumer. So I'm not entirely surprised to see that the beauty category came under some pressure, as well as I think the outdoor category. Sporting goods, I think, has been a little iffy out there just as a broad retail sales category. So I'm not surprised.
I'm not surprised either, to be honest. Looking at the big picture, if you look at what's happening, the increased cost of auto insurance, homeowners insurance, property taxes, et cetera, especially in some of the states like my own. Yes, I know I'm talking about Florida again, folks. That takes away from discretionary spending in a severe manner that most people do not understand unless you live in one of those areas. And it translates to California and New York City, et cetera. If your income is not keeping pace with the rate of inflation, especially in the services side of things, especially with monthly necessities, payment you have to make to sit there and live in your home, drive your car, et cetera, it becomes easier to cut out, like you said, Neely, sporting goods, cosmetics, alcohol, eating out for dinner, the trip to Disney World that you financed for 5 years at $5,000. It's insane, and people need to understand that there's going to have an impact on spending over the long term, which might highlight David Rosenberg's recall again today for a deflationary bout to eventually hit the economy and correct everything that's going on. And then I lose everyone. Okay. No. I thought I lost everyone. Sometimes I get long-winded. I apologize for that, Neely.
Well, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to be with you for this past hour. I actually have to go.
No.
I've still got another 2 hours of my
No problem. Please plug your website and talk more about it. And I'm going to plug our website so we can get everybody signed up to MacroEdge.net. Go ahead, please.
You bet. So distilladvisory.com, we're Distill. In there we have our consulting practice. We also have a data product, which is really more of a data project right at this point in time. But the reason why we hang out on this platform is really to interact with just beautifully wise and bright people. Thank you so much, John, for inviting me here. Thank you, Weimar, for engaging. Ulysses, it's always a joy to have a fellow Minnesotan up on the dais, as it were. And I'm just really grateful to have an opportunity to, there's an old proverb that says, when iron sharpens iron, that's kind of what you want in friendships and in engagements and in partnerships. And it's true that sparks will fly when iron sharpens iron, but when done with well intent, everyone gets a little sharper. So thank you for that opportunity to do that today.
Neely, thank you so much for your time. I know you've been very gracious with it, and everybody in the audience appreciates that. We appreciate having you on, and believe me, I will be pestering you again, probably in the third, fourth quarter, to sit there and talk about the Christmas season and sales at that point in time. And remember, folks, MacroEdge.net, MacroEdge.net. Sign up for the free trial for Ozone. You get a 2-week trial if you sign up there. MacroEdge.net. For MacroEdge Radio number 14, this is John Galt speaking. Good night, everyone.